Russia thought the Black Sea was theirs. They were wrong. In the span of just 72 hours, not weeks, not months, 72 hours, Ukraine deployed a weapon system so unexpected, so strategically disruptive, that the entire Russian naval posture in the region just fundamentally changed. This was not another missile strike. This was not another drone boat attack. This was something the Kremlin never saw coming until their radar operators started reporting contacts that should not exist. Welcome to States News. If this is your first time here, subscribe and turn on notifications because what I am about to show you is not being covered anywhere else with this level of detail. The mainstream outlets are calling this a minor naval development. They are missing the entire strategic picture. By the time we are done, you will understand exactly why the balance of power in the Black Sea just shifted in a way that changes everything about how this war gets fought. I am going to show you exactly what Ukraine just deployed, why Russia's entire Black Sea Fleet command structure is scrambling to respond, and how this single capability threatens to unravel years of Russian investment in naval dominance. We will cover the technical specifications of this weapon system, the strategic doctrine that makes it so devastating, and the second-order effects rippling through alliance structures from Ankara to Washington. By the end, you will understand why this development represents the most significant shift in Black Sea power dynamics since the war began, and why it has implications that extend far beyond Ukraine's immediate battlefield needs. Let me establish the strategic context that makes this development so significant. The Black Sea is not just another body of water. It is a contested strategic space that determines access to the Mediterranean, controls vital shipping lanes for global grain exports, and serves as the southern anchor of Russia's power projection into the Middle East and North Africa. For over 2 years, Russia has maintained effective naval superiority in this theater despite losing their flagship Moskva and suffering repeated humiliations from Ukrainian drone boats and anti-ship missiles. That superiority rested on a simple reality. Ukraine had no navy. Russia could operate surface vessels, conduct shore bombardment, enforce blockades, and project power with relative impunity because Ukrainian capabilities were limited to asymmetric attacks using unmanned systems. The strategic importance of the Black Sea extends beyond immediate military considerations. Prior to Russia's full-scale invasion in February 2022, approximately 138 cargo ships transited the Black Sea daily, carrying Ukrainian grain that fed populations across Africa and the Middle East. Russian naval dominance allowed Moscow to weaponize food security, blocking grain exports and creating leverage over nations dependent on Ukrainian agricultural products. The Grain Corridor Agreement, brokered by Turkey and the United Nations in July 2022, temporarily alleviated this crisis. But Russia's withdrawal from that agreement in July 2023 returned the Black Sea to a state of contested access. Every ship attempting to reach Ukrainian ports operated under the implicit threat of Russian interdiction. Ukraine's response to this strategic challenge has been remarkable. Without a functioning navy, they have used modified maritime drones, essentially remote-controlled explosive boats, to strike Russian vessels at anchor and during transit. These attacks inflicted genuine damage, sinking the landing ship Saratov, severely damaging the frigate Admiral Makarov, and forcing the Black Sea Fleet to relocate much of its operational base from Sevastopol in occupied Crimea to Novorossiysk on Russia's mainland coast. But these were tactical victories, not strategic ones. Drone boats operate at slow speeds, have limited range, and can be detected and interdicted by alert defenders. They disrupted Russian operations but did not fundamentally alter the balance of naval power. Russia adapted to the drone boat threat through enhanced perimeter defenses, improved radar coverage, and the deployment of patrol craft specifically configured to hunt and destroy these unmanned vessels before they could reach high-value targets. By late 2025, Russian commanders had developed confidence that they had contained the drone boat problem to manageable proportions. That confidence just evaporated. Now here is what Ukraine just deployed, and why Russian naval planners are genuinely alarmed. According to multiple reports from defense analysts monitoring Black Sea operations and confirmed by satellite imagery analyzed by independent research organizations, Ukraine has successfully deployed submarine drones. Not remote-controlled surface boats that skim along the waterline where they can be spotted and engaged, actual submersible unmanned vehicles capable of operating underwater at depths that make detection extraordinarily difficult with conventional naval radar systems. These are designated as extra-large unmanned underwater vehicles, or XLUVs in military terminology, and they represent a categorical shift in Ukraine's offensive capabilities. The specifications matter enormously. Based on analysis from naval experts interviewed by Defense News and corroborated by Ukrainian sources speaking to Radio Free Europe, these systems operate at depths between 20 and 50 meters, well below the detection envelope of standard surface search radar. They are estimated to carry explosive payloads in the range of 400 to 600 kilograms, sufficient to catastrophically damage or sink frigates, corvettes, and auxiliary vessels. Their operational range appears to exceed 200 nautical miles, which means they can be launched from Ukrainian-controlled coastline and strike targets across the entire northwestern quadrant of the Black Sea, including approaches to Sevastopol and the entire operational zone, where Russian vessels conduct patrols and shore bombardment missions. Think about what that means for a moment. Russia's entire defensive posture against Ukrainian maritime threats was built around detecting surface contacts. Their patrol craft scan the horizon with optical systems and surface search radar. Their helicopters hunt for the distinctive wake patterns that drone boats create. Their shore-based defenses are optimized to engage threats they can see coming across the water. None of that infrastructure is designed to detect and engage submerged contacts operating at tactical depths in littoral waters. Russia has anti-submarine warfare capabilities, absolutely, but those systems are designed for deep-water operations against nuclear submarines in the Atlantic or Pacific. The Black Sea is shallow, noisy from commercial shipping, and filled with complex underwater terrain that creates acoustic clutter. Finding a relatively small unmanned submersible in that environment is extraordinarily difficult even with dedicated ASW assets. The tactical implications are immediate and severe. Every Russian surface vessel operating in the northwestern Black Sea now faces a threat it cannot effectively counter with existing defensive systems. Captains who previously worried about drone boats they could spot and engage now must consider the possibility that a torpedo-sized submersible loaded with half a ton of explosives is approaching from below at this very moment, and they have no reliable way to know it is there until detonation. That fundamentally changes operational calculus. Ships that previously conducted shore bombardment missions close to Ukrainian coastal positions now must operate from standoff distances where their gunfire becomes less accurate and less effective. Patrol patterns that previously allowed Russian vessels to enforce blockade zones now expose those vessels to unacceptable risk. The psychological effect on Russian naval personnel cannot be overstated. Operating under constant threat from an enemy you cannot see or effectively defend against is corrosive to morale and combat effectiveness. But the strategic implications extend far beyond tactical disruptions to Russian naval operations. Step back and look at what this capability does to Russia's entire Black Sea strategy. Moscow's naval dominance has been the foundation for multiple strategic objectives. First, it enabled the grain blockade that gave Russia leverage over global food security. Second, it allowed shore bombardment that threatened Ukrainian coastal cities and infrastructure. Third, it provided a secure logistics route for supplying Russian forces in occupied Crimea and southern Ukraine. Fourth, it projected Russian power southward into the Mediterranean through the Bosphorus, maintaining Moscow's naval presence in Syria and Libya. Every single one of those strategic functions now operates under a fundamentally different risk calculus. Consider the grain corridor specifically. Turkey has been negotiating with both Russia and Ukraine to restore safe passage for commercial shipping through the Black Sea. Those negotiations have repeatedly stalled because Russia maintained the capability to interdict shipping at will, and Ukraine lacked the means to provide credible protection for merchant vessels entering their ports. That dynamic just shifted. Ukraine cannot guarantee absolute safety for commercial shipping, but they can now impose comparable risk on Russian vessels attempting to enforce a blockade. A Russian corvette attempting to intercept a grain freighter must now consider that doing so might attract a submarine drone it cannot detect or defend against. That changes the calculus for Moscow. The cost of maintaining the blockade just increased substantially, while the benefit of that blockade in terms of leverage over Ukraine and international pressure decreases as alternative export routes through Romania and Poland have been developed. The second-order effects ripple outward from the Black Sea into broader alliance structures and defense industrial strategies. Ukraine did not develop this capability in isolation. The technical sophistication required to build long-range submersible drones with precision guidance and substantial payload capacity suggests external support. Western defense contractors, most likely American or British firms with submarine warfare expertise, almost certainly provided technical assistance, design specifications, or critical components. This represents a significant escalation in the type of capabilities Western nations are willing to provide Ukraine. Early in the war, the focus was on defensive systems, anti-tank missiles, air defense, artillery. Then came offensive systems with range limitations, HIMARS with restrictions on striking Russian territory, tanks with agreements about operational use. Now we are seeing the provision or enablement of capabilities that threaten Russian strategic assets with minimal warning and limited defensive options. That escalation sends messages beyond the immediate battlefield. China is watching very carefully how Western nations support Ukraine with increasingly sophisticated weapon systems. Beijing is drawing conclusions about what similar support might look like for Taiwan in a crisis scenario. If the United States and European allies are willing to help Ukraine develop or acquire submarine drones that can threaten a major Russian naval fleet, what would they be willing to provide Taiwan to threaten Chinese amphibious forces in the Taiwan Strait? These are the kind of strategic calculations happening in capitals around the world, as they observe not just what Ukraine accomplishes on the battlefield, but what enabling support structure makes those accomplishments possible. Russia is also being forced into resource allocation decisions it did not want to make. Moscow now must divert anti-submarine warfare assets to the Black Sea that were previously positioned elsewhere or held in reserve for high-end conflict scenarios. They need to invest in sonar systems, deploy additional ASW helicopters, potentially relocate submarine hunting frigates from the Northern Fleet or Pacific Fleet to the Black Sea. Every one of those assets moved south is an asset unavailable for other missions in other theaters. This is the definition of strategic overstretch. Russia is already struggling to maintain adequate force levels across multiple fronts: the grinding war in eastern Ukraine, garrison forces in occupied territories, borders with NATO members in the Baltic region, and far eastern deployments facing Japan and monitoring the Pacific. Now, they must surge additional high-value assets to deal with a threat in the Black Sea that did not exist 3 days ago. Let me show you exactly how this plays out in operational terms. According to reports from Ukrainian military sources cited by Kyiv Independent and corroborated by monitoring from Turkish defense analysts, Russia has already begun altering patrol patterns in response to the submarine drone threat. Vessels that previously operated in established zones close to Ukrainian-controlled coastline have pulled back to positions further from shore, reducing their ability to conduct effective reconnaissance or shore bombardment. Transit routes for supply ships moving between Novorossiysk and Sevastopol have shifted to deeper water further from the Ukrainian coast, adding hours to each voyage and reducing the throughput of logistics support to occupied Crimea. Russian naval aviation has increased the tempo of ASW patrol flights, but those aircraft are searching for threats in an environment where they lack the sensor fidelity to reliably detect small submersibles in shallow, acoustically cluttered water. The most significant operational change involves Sevastopol itself. The Black Sea Fleet headquarters and primary naval base in occupied Crimea has already been subjected to repeated Ukrainian attacks using cruise missiles and drone boats. Those strikes forced Russia to relocate some high-value assets to Novorossiysk on the Russian mainland. The submarine drone threat makes Sevastopol even more untenable as an operational base. The approaches to the harbor are relatively shallow and confined, exactly the kind of environment where submersible drones would be most effective. A Ukrainian XLUUV could position itself along known transit routes into and out of Sevastopol and wait for targets of opportunity. Russian defenders cannot effectively secure those approaches without resources they do not currently have deployed in theater. The strategic consequence is clear. Sevastopol's utility as a naval base continues to degrade, and Russia's massive investment in maintaining that facility as the anchor of Black Sea Fleet operations continues to deliver diminishing returns. There is another dimension to this that deserves attention, and it connects directly to the economic warfare aspects of this conflict. Russia has been attempting to maintain commercial shipping activity through its Black Sea ports despite the war. Novorossiysk handles substantial oil exports, and those revenues are critical to Moscow's ability to sustain the war economy. The presence of Ukrainian submarine drones in the Black Sea creates a new category of risk for commercial vessels and insurance markets. If a Ukrainian submersible can threaten Russian warships, it can theoretically threaten commercial tankers loading at Russian ports. Ukraine has no incentive to attack neutral commercial shipping, and doing so would be strategically counterproductive, but the mere possibility affects insurance rates and shipping decisions. Some commercial operators may decide that the risk premium for Black Sea routes through Russian waters is no longer acceptable, leading to reduced traffic and reduced revenue for Moscow. Now let me acknowledge the limitations and complexities that conventional coverage is missing. Ukraine's submarine drones represent a significant capability, but they are not a panacea that instantly negates Russian naval power. These systems face real operational constraints. Battery endurance limits their range and time on station. Navigation in shallow coastal waters filled with currents, commercial traffic, and underwater obstacles requires sophisticated guidance systems that may not work perfectly in all conditions. The explosive payload, while substantial for an unmanned system, is smaller than what a traditional torpedo carries, meaning it may damage but not necessarily sink larger vessels with modern damage control capabilities. Russia will adapt, as they have adapted to previous Ukrainian innovations, by deploying countermeasures and adjusting tactics. There are also questions about production scale and sustainability. Building sophisticated submersible drones requires advanced manufacturing capabilities, specialized components, and substantial resources. How many of these systems can Ukraine produce or acquire? Can they sustain operations if Russia succeeds in destroying production facilities or interdicting supply chains that provide critical components? These are unresolved questions that will determine whether this capability represents a temporary tactical advantage or an enduring strategic shift. Initial deployment of a new weapons system and sustained operational effectiveness at scale are two very different things. Alternative perspectives exist on what this development actually signifies. Some analysts argue that the submarine drone threat is being overstated, that Russia's ASW capabilities are more robust than generally acknowledged, and that the Black Sea Fleet will adapt to this threat just as they adapted to drone boats. These analysts point out that Ukraine has made similar announcements about game-changing capabilities before, and while those capabilities inflicted genuine damage, they did not fundamentally alter the strategic balance. There is merit to this skepticism. War is a dynamic interaction between adversaries who continually adapt to each other's innovations. Russia has proven resilient in developing countermeasures to Ukrainian tactics, and there is no reason to assume they will not do so again. There are also questions about strategic signaling and information operations. Did Ukraine announce this capability specifically to create psychological pressure on Russian naval commanders and force them into costly defensive adaptations, even if the actual operational capability is more limited than suggested? Modern conflict involves perception management as much as kinetic effects. Ukraine has every incentive to portray their capabilities in the most threatening light possible to maximize deterrent effect and force Russia into resource-intensive defensive measures. We should consider the possibility that the reality of this capability may be somewhat less dramatic than the public presentation suggests, even if the core capability itself is genuine. Here is what this tells us about where the Black Sea theater is heading and what it means for the broader trajectory of this war. Ukraine has demonstrated once again that strategic creativity and asymmetric innovation can offset massive disparities in conventional military power. They have consistently identified Russian vulnerabilities and developed capabilities that exploit those vulnerabilities, despite operating with a fraction of Russia's defense budget and industrial base. The submarine drone deployment fits this pattern perfectly. Russia invested billions in a surface fleet designed for power projection and sea control. Ukraine developed a relatively inexpensive submersible system that threatens the viability of that entire investment. The broader implication is that this war is accelerating the transformation of naval warfare in ways that will echo for decades. Unmanned systems, both aerial and maritime, are proving far more effective and survivable than many defense planners anticipated. The lesson being absorbed by naval strategies around the world is that large surface combatants are increasingly vulnerable to small, cheap, unmanned systems that can be deployed in sufficient numbers to overwhelm defensive capabilities. This has profound implications for how nations think about naval power, force structure, and investment priorities. The United States Navy is watching Ukrainian operations in the Black Sea and drawing conclusions about how to counter Chinese naval power in the Pacific using similar asymmetric approaches. The era of the aircraft carrier battle group as the unquestioned apex of naval power is being challenged by the demonstrated effectiveness of distributed, unmanned systems. For Russia, this development represents another strategic setback in a war that has delivered a continuous series of unpleasant surprises. Moscow expected to achieve rapid victory through conventional military superiority. Instead, They have been drawn into a grinding attritional conflict where their advantages in manpower and industrial capacity are being eroded by Ukrainian innovation, Western support, and their own strategic miscalculations. The Black Sea was supposed to be a Russian lake where Moscow's naval dominance was uncontested. It has become another theater where Russia must constantly adapt to threats they did not anticipate and struggle to defend assets they assumed were secure. The submarine drone deployment will not end the war. It will not force Russia to withdraw from occupied territories or fundamentally alter the land warfare dynamics in eastern Ukraine. But it does represent another incremental degradation of Russia's strategic position, another capability they must divert resources to counter, another reminder that this war is not proceeding according to the plan Moscow envisioned when they launched their invasion. The cumulative effect of these incremental setbacks is strategic exhaustion. Russia finds itself fighting a war on multiple fronts in multiple domains against an adversary that refuses to be intimidated and continues to find new ways to impose costs that Moscow struggles to absorb. Ukraine's message with this deployment is clear. The war will continue. Ukrainian capabilities will continue to expand, and Russia's assumed advantages will continue to be challenged through innovation and determination. For anyone following this conflict seriously, for anyone trying to understand how strategic dynamics actually shift rather than just tracking daily battlefield developments, this is the kind of development that matters. It represents a fundamental change in what is possible, what is threatened, and what calculations both sides must make as they plan their next moves. We will continue tracking how Russia responds to this threat, whether Ukraine can sustain these operations at scale, and what this means for Black Sea maritime security in the months ahead. If you want analysis that goes beyond surface-level reporting, that shows you the strategic dimensions mainstream coverage misses, subscribe to States News and turn on notifications. The next major development could happen tomorrow, and you will want to understand exactly why it matters.